Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the tails of vertebrates, their forms, and functions. First, I'm going to talk about what a tail is made of and where it comes from. And then I'm going to get more specific and talk about species that have different uses for their tails. Okay, so the tail is comprised of caudal vertebrae and flesh. There's no viscera in the tail. So it begins to form in the embryo of every vertebrate. It derives from the post-anal extension called the tail bud. It is possible that gene regulation controls the final length of the tail and possibly the functional characteristics of the adult vertebrate tail. In one study that I read, it was shown in mice that progenitor promoting and repressing activities provided by gene regulations can actually change the morphology of the adult tail. This was tested in mice. So the hypothesis that is widely accepted as the origin of the tail in vertebrates is that it was evolved as a locomotor adaptation. So it helped marine vertebrates move around. So this hypothesis is actually supported by biomechanical data as well as using an evolutionary approach. I found one study that tried to use an evolutionary approach because biomechanical data had already been provided. So in fish, obviously, the post-anal tail structure is primarily used for locomotion. So there are different morphologies of the tail, and it allows fish to move in different ways. But there are more diverse uses of tails when we get into terrestrial vertebrates. So I'm going to compare terrestrial vertebrates to each other. And I'm going to compare 3 different groups and their functions and structures of 4 different species. So first, I'm going to talk about the salamander. So I have pictured here an axolotl. I think they're really, really cute. Um, but they are terrestrial. No, they are not terrestrial. They spend their entire existence in water. So they're marine salamanders. This is also true of terrestrial salamanders, but we're going to focus on this little guy here. So they actually, since they live in water, their tail does actually aid in locomotion. It helps them swim. It is used as a rudder mostly. But they also store fat and proteins in their tail. The most interesting thing that I found is that salamanders have the ability to regrow their tail if it gets damaged. And they can also self-amputate their tails. If they're being attacked by a predator, if something has them by the tail in their mouth, they can actually just self-amputate, get rid of that tail, and then start the process of regenerating it. So the process is really highly energy intensive. So they don't want to do it if they can get away any other way. But if they don't have any choice, if it's lose their tail or die, then they're going to try and get rid of their tail and have to regrow it. So they'll have to take in more nutrients so that they can regenerate that part of their body. So when they do that, they're regenerating their central body axis, and the process actually regrows their spinal cord. So one of the studies that I found was talking about trying to replicate this process in other animals, because it would be really cool if we could actually regrow our own spinal cords, which obviously if someone has a spinal cord injury, they can't, they have loss of movement in a lot of their body because they can't actually regenerate the spinal cord itself. So next is the kangaroo. So kangaroos actually do use their tails primarily for locomotion, but they use pentapedal or 5-limb locomotion when they're moving slowly. So when they're walking, they actually use it as a 5th limb. The musculature, they have a high degree of musculature in their tail that allows them to actually use it and support their weight on it. But when they're moving at a really, really fast speed, they can actually use their tail's weight as a counterbalance to sort of keep them from tipping over. So I also wanted to focus on a couple of animals that are a little bit closer to home. So the North American beaver, we kind of all know this one. They're fairly charismatic little mammals, but their tails are flat and oval shaped, but they're also hairless and have a like hard rubbery surface. I've shown a picture right here. This is what their tail kind of looks like close up. So, since they are semi-aquatic, you can tell that, obviously, if you know what a beaver is, they live a lot of their life in water, but also they have webbed feet, and their tail is actually used as a rudder when they're swimming. So that isn't the only thing in the water that they do with their tails. They actually use it to warn off predators as well. They when I went kayaking this summer, I got too close to a beaver and it smacked the top of the water with its tail, trying to scare me off, obviously. But so they smack the top of the water and then they swim away as fast as they can. Because they don't really have a follow-up to smacking the water. They just want to try and scare you to go the other way as well. But it is used for their tail's also used for fat storage. So when they have a lot of fat to store and they're really healthy, their tails are a little bit plumper. And when there isn't a lot of fat to store because they don't have a lot of excess, the surface kind of appears wrinkly. You can actually tell the difference between a healthy and an underfed beaver just by looking at its tail. But my favorite factoid that I learned while I was researching their tail is that it actually is a source of countercurrent heat exchange. The arrangement of blood vessels allows them to use countercurrent exchange to retain body heat in the winter. So in general, they lose about 25% of their heat through that countercurrent exchange system in the summer months. But they can reduce that to 2% in the winter, which I think is really fascinating. And it makes sense because they do live in a place that gets really cold all the time, or well, half of the year, basically. And last, another animal pretty close to home, a white-tailed deer. This one I chose because they only use their tail as an alarm system. So the only reason so there are some animals that use their tails in like sexual selection, where they're showing a potential mate that they can spend the energy to make this fantastic display, like peacocks. But in this case, it doesn't have anything to do with sexual selection. It is entirely used as an alarm system. We call it tail flagging. And it alerts others that they live with, others in their group, that there's danger nearby. So there's a predator somewhere. So they lift their tail, showing that ventral side, which is completely white, and then they run away. So any of the deer behind them would be able to see this warning sign, and then they can run away faster, and hopefully keep the group whole. And I just wanted to make a little note here. One of the defining features that we learned at the beginning of the semester about vertebrates is the post-anal tail. So I didn't look at it as from the evolutionary history. I did look at it from the fact that it is an adaptation. So the because it's present in all vertebrates, the form that it takes in the adult forms of terrestrial and marine vertebrates are completely different. They're obviously really useful to that individual species in their niche, and the form looks different between organisms because it plays a different role in the life history of the organism. And obviously, from just the four that I've shown, they all have different uses. They may have similar uses, but they do it in different ways. And there's a bunch of uses that I couldn't cover in 10 minutes. So, so It's a really important adaptation to all animals, and even some of them, like humans, have lost their tails completely because we don't use them. So thank you so much for listening, and here are my references. Bye.
This show is a member of the Rhinobot Studios family. For more information, including show listings, team member bios, social media links, and our community Discord, please visit rhinobot.net.